What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas. Good morning, everybody. Sunday morning, August 18th, 2019. And in case you have been living under a rock, UFC 241 went down last night. Biggest card of the summer. I had to wake up early, get ready, get prepared, get set, and just ready to go for this UFC 241 post-fight reaction show on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me, everybody. Whether you're joining me on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or TrainwreckSports.com, I greatly appreciate all the love and support that I've received from the sports fans out there. Whether you're a football fan, whether you're an MMA fan, whether you're a baseball fan, a hockey fan, boxing fan, I've greatly appreciated all of the reviews and comments, I guess you could say, as well, on the podcast and how much you guys enjoy it. And I could not appreciate that more. So thank you so much for tuning in to today's show, and thank you so much for tuning in to previous shows that I've done leading up to UFC 241 and some of the fantasy football stuff that I've been putting out. So, all that being said, my favorite part of a UFC event is kind of diving into what should happen afterwards. What's next for the winners and losers of UFC 241, but also recap the fights. And I've done plenty of post-fight reaction shows on this podcast throughout the last 3 years. Actually, after every UFC pay-per-view, I do a post-fight reaction. And that's what you can come to expect for all the new listeners that have tuned into the podcast within the last 6 months. Guys, I have had more growth in the last 6 months of the show than I had the previous year. That is how fast and rapid this show is growing, rapidly growing. So I could not, say enough as far as what to expect. You can expect a UFC pay-per-view post-fight reaction show each and every time. So when you subscribe to this channel and you know that a big UFC pay-per-view is coming up, expect me to recap it on the podcast. UFC 2 whatever post-fight, UFC 3 whatever post-fight. I'll be doing these to the day I die. So, we'll go as long as we can. So, all that being said, these were some really great fights last night. If you can't tell, my voice is actually a little bit hoarse. I went out with some friends and my dad last night, and it was great to watch the fights with my friends and my dad last night. I hadn't done that in a long time with some of the friends that came out. So, shout out to them for meeting me out last night and us having a good time. Some of my high school buddies, buddy Tom, buddy Sean, my buddy Eric, and it was a great time. And my dad too. We got to take in the fights, and that's the best part about the fights, is that they kind of bring everybody together, and you want to watch them with a lot of people. I could not imagine watching these UFC pay-per-views by myself. That would be pretty terrible. So last night's fights were really great. The card lived up to all the hype, in my opinion. 3 fights in particular that were the main fights that were being promoted on this card are the fights that I'm really going to go over. I really did not like the Derek Brunson fight. I thought that for an opener on a pay-per-view, in terms of entertainment value that fight brought to the audience, I did not enjoy it. I thought that it could have just been a little bit more action in there, a little bit stagnant at times between Brunson and his opponent. His name's not coming to my mind, as this always happens. But I definitely thought that fight was a little bit slow, was not as action-packed as I had hoped that it would be against Ian Heinisch. That's the name of the opponent that Brunson fought last night, Heinisch, and I really like Heinisch. I thought he did a lot of really good things, but Brunson got the decision, and that is that. Sodiq Yusuff, another finish. Another great knockout victory over Gabriel Benitez. Youssef is a guy to really watch out for in the UFC featherweight division. He's 10-1. He's finished, I think, 8 or 9 of his 10 victories. I think he's a guy that you really need to watch out for in that UFC featherweight division. And then, the third fight next to the co-main event, next to the main event, obviously, was a crucial middleweight fight between Paulo Costa and Yoel Romero. And that fight was a close, razor-thin decision for Paulo Costa. And when you look at the fight stats of the fight, each guy knocked each other down. One knockdown for Romero, one knockdown for Paulo Costa. Statistics of total strikes, 125 out of 284 for Romero and 118 of 213. Significant strikes, Costa landed 55%, Romero landed 44%, and Romero also had one takedown. No submission attempts between either fighter. There was a lot of controversy about how this decision was read out. A lot of people thought that Yoel Romero won, and I got to tell you, I did not. I did not think that Yoel Romero won this fight last night against Paulo Costa, and I'll tell you why. This is an MMA fight, a mixed martial arts fight, where whoever mixes their disciplines better than the other guy wins the fight. And it's very tough to score a takedown for a gentleman in which Yoel Romero, as I said, got the only takedown of the fight. But the takedown was at the end of a round, and there were other scrambles where Paulo Costa really was not down on the mat. So Romero does something that he is well known for throughout his career, and that is taking breaks, pausing the action between fights, whether he's committing a foul on his opponent or whether a foul is committed to him, to Romero himself. And I thought that the pause in the action where Costa kneed Romero in the groin area, upon further review, upon the replay, upon watching the replay, that was not a quote-unquote nut shot. Pardon my French, but he didn't take one of the pills is what I'm saying. And Costa, I thought, landed it on the waist of Romero, which would not be a low blow. And Romero pauses the action. He's exhausted. He threw way too many punches early on in the fight in the first round, all while backing up. And that was a common theme within the fight. I think if you looked at the advanced statistics, literally how much did Romero advance the action, push the pace of the fight, it had to have been less than 15% of the fight. So how can you give Romero a unanimous decision? Maybe it should have been 29-28 Costa. I thought Costa won the first 2 rounds of the fight, and then Romero won the third round. If you want to give Romero any round in the fight, it was the third round. Beyond that, I thought Costa won the fight. I'm honestly losing my voice. Thanks, Stipe, for that. So, I thought Costa won the fight. I thought he fought well. I thought he fought Yoel Romero as best as he could. And really, where I would have a little bit of a problem with Costa's performance is that he let Yoel Romero get back into the fight within that third round. I think he let Romero's tongue sticking out, the trash talk, all that stuff kind of get to him a little bit. And that's when Costa started to kind of do the same thing. Well, maybe I'm going to hang out against the cage. No, that's stupid. That's stupid. Nobody appreciates that. I know I don't as a fight fan. If I'm a judge and I'm judging 2 fighters and I'm trying to figure out who's actually winning a fight, if this goes 15 minutes or in the case of a main event title fight, this goes 25 minutes, I'm not looking for a guy that sticks his tongue out and hangs out on the cage. That's not cool to me. That's not funny. You're not Anderson Silva, Yoel Romero. You're not Anderson Silva, Paulo Costa. It's just not needed. These guys, Yoel Romero, Paulo Costa, in their positions in their career prior to this fight have a lot to prove. Romero is trying to get back into title contention, and he's not getting any younger. He's 42 years old. Paulo Costa, young gun, he's trying to get into title contention. Why these guys did that, why these guys backed their backs to the cage, stuck their tongues out at one another, it honestly, it was stupid. And I really didn't appreciate that. When I'm watching a UFC pay-per-view, I want to see these guys fight. To an extent, the guys that can get away with doing things like that are guys that have been in the UFC for over a decade. Guys like Nate Diaz, guys like Conor McGregor, who have the pull that they have. Conor hasn't been in the UFC for 10 years, but you get my point. Fighters that you expect to see that from. Yoel Romero and Paulo Costa really had to get in there and fight each other. And I thought Romero wasted a lot of time doing those things. And I thought Costa let Romero back into the fight by doing those things. Romero knew that Costa was stronger, faster, younger than him heading into the fight and during the fight. So he was trying to do whatever he could to bait Costa into an exchange, to hopefully catch Costa, because he wasn't catching him by keeping his back to the cage like that in the entire fight. I don't know how people could think Yoel Romero won that fight. And the highlight reel, the clips after the fight that the UFC produced were very biased. Very biased. Costa landed some really hard shots that the UFC production team just didn't want to show. That was way closer of a fight than what the UFC production team thought it was. They showed clips of just Romero landing these big punches on Costa, where Costa landed a lot of big punches, particularly to the body of Yoel Romero, that they didn't even show. And I thought that was weird. I thought that was very strange. And I thought Costa won. I really did. And I do, obviously. So what's next for him, obviously? I think he's the next in line for a potential middleweight showdown for the title. Depending on how that middleweight division shakes out in October, Robert Whittaker will defend his UFC middleweight title against the UFC interim middleweight champ, Israel Adesanya, in Melbourne, Australia. Huge crowd for that one. A highly anticipated fight. Big fight for the UFC. Big fight for the UFC's middleweight division. You got two studs in there that are going to duke it out, and we'll find out who's next for Paulo Costa after watching that. The only trepidation they might have with giving Costa a title shot is that Whittaker and Adesanya could be such a close fight that it might warrant a rematch depending on the result. So Costa might have to stay active and get another win, maybe fighter Jack Hermanson or somebody else in that middleweight division before he gets his title shot. We'll see. But great performance from Costa, great performance from Romero. It was a good fight, just was not the fight that I thought people thought it was. I didn't think that Romero was somebody that won that fight handily. So moving on, you have the next fight, the co-main event, Nate Diaz versus Anthony Pettis. And this was a fight that when it was announced, I had it circled on my calendar. I've been anticipating this fight for a while. This is one that I really wanted to see. This is the type of matchup that I felt like was the best return fight for Nate Diaz, because he had taken 3 years off, really not off from training, but 3 years off from active competition. Had not fought, except for 3 years ago versus Conor McGregor, UFC 202. That felt like forever ago. So to see Nate back in there, I went in depth about that on the in-depth Nate Diaz Returns podcast episode. And I could not be more impressed by how Nate Diaz fought last night. I thought he fought great. I thought for a guy that took 3 years off from active competition, you're not under the bright lights, you don't have your feet in the octagon in front of a live audience in 3 years. For Nate Diaz to fight the way that he did and to win the way that he did, truly dominant fashion. Easily 30-27 on all three judges' scorecards. That was a great performance. That might be one of the best performances of Nate Diaz's career. And when they read off the performance of the night bonuses, I thought that Nate Diaz was definitely going to get one, the $50,000 extra. But I'm sure Nate got paid. I'm sure he got his money, and I'm sure that he will seek to it that he gets paid for his next fight. Anthony Pettis, I thought, really could not do much of anything. Nate Diaz neutralized Anthony Pettis' striking by fighting this in-close, high-pace, swarming style that Nate Diaz has implemented throughout his entire career. I mean, you can go back, look at his fights with Gray Maynard, look at his fights with Conor, obviously, look at his fights versus Michael Johnson. His fight versus Michael Johnson was another fight where Nate Diaz likes to fight long. He pulls punches. He forces fighters to fight long as well. And then he uses his reach advantage. And he did that very well last night, too. Anthony Pettis is as tough as they come, though. He landed a lot of nice shots, but it just wasn't enough. As soon as Pettis landed one or two nice shots, Nate Diaz was right on top of him, ready to swarm him. And when Pettis would get caught against that octagon, Diaz would use it to his advantage and force Pettis against the cage. And I really enjoyed that. I thought that Nate Diaz fought a phenomenal fight. And I shit you not, before the fight with Diaz and Pettis, I looked at who Nate Diaz could fight if he wins. And I thought Jorge Masvidal would be a great opponent. And when Nate Diaz called out Jorge Masvidal after that fight, I lost it. I think that right there could be one of the best fights in recent memory to ever be made. Two guys that have been in the UFC for a very long time, 14, 15 years, fighting an active MMA competition. These guys have been around for forever. And for these guys to fight each other at 170 without having to cut weight, Masvidal at one point fought at 185, so he's going to cut a little bit of weight. Diaz will probably cut a little bit of weight too. He's very big now. I like that. I like that a lot. I like that concept of that fight. The trash talk leading up to that fight will be phenomenal. And I think that's a fight that ultimately will happen because it's a fight that the fans want to see, and it's a fight that, let's face it, these last 3 years without Nate Diaz have not been fun, have not been fun at all. And, part of my reaction to the Nate Diaz situation, he beats Anthony Pettis. Dominant win, 3-0. The first round, maybe he was shaking off some cobwebs, but I thought he won every round. But a judge gave Pettis, I believe, the first round of that fight. And I guess that's fair, but I personally thought Nate Diaz won every round. People are thinking, well, who's he going to call out? Who's next? Who could he call out? And you think to yourself, well, maybe Conor is next. Maybe Conor McGregor will be the guy that he will call out. I am so thankful that he didn't call out Conor McGregor. I'm thankful that he did call out Jorge Masvidal, because I think we will get that third fight somewhere down the road between McGregor and Diaz. Maybe by the time McGregor's a little bit older and Diaz is maybe in the next couple years we'll get that fight. A lot of time has been missed out on due to the fact that Diaz took the 3 years off that he did. And I think part of that was because he wanted to hold out for that rematch, or that third trilogy fight with Conor, or that there just wasn't enough gangsters out there, in his words, for him to fight. But I really think that the sport, it was proven last night that if you're John Jones, if you're GSP, if you're Conor McGregor, no matter who you are, the sport will pass you by. if you're inactive long enough, the sport will pass you by. But if you're a guy like Nate Diaz, who everyone wants to see fight, who everyone knows what he brings to the table, and there's matchups out there for him that are interesting and captivating, like the fight with Diaz versus Pettis last night, that was a great matchup. That's a fight that anyone would want to watch at any given time. So when you have a fighter like that has fights out there for him that anyone would want to watch at any given time, the guy will fight anyone, but he wants to get paid right due to the fact that he understands that he's probably one of the three biggest draws in MMA right now. I'd say Conor, Nate, and John Jones are the three biggest draws in MMA right now. But if you're Conor McGregor and you're holding out for this Khabib Nurmagomedov rematch, look at how this UFC division at lightweight has moved on. You have an opportunity for Conor to fight Donald Cerrone again, or to fight Donald Cerrone, another opportunity for him to fight him. It didn't happen. You had an opportunity for Conor to fight Justin Gaethje. That didn't happen. You had 3 years to create a trilogy fight with Nate Diaz. That didn't happen. You fight Khabib, you lose in dominant fashion, and now you're on the sidelines waiting for your rematch. Meanwhile, the sport is moving on. And now Nate Diaz is moving on. He wants Jorge Masvidal. So my point is, no draw is bigger than the sport. Ever. No matter who you are. No draw is bigger than the sport. Maybe Conor will get that rematch that he's been waiting on with Khabib Nurmagomedov. Maybe not maybe. He most definitely will at some point. That fight will happen. But that fight's not good for Conor's career. That fight's not good for the UFC. We know that. The aftermath of that fight was not great for obvious reasons, and then the matchup itself is terrible for Conor. So, all that being said, where I'm going with this is that I'm proud of Nate that he did call out Jorge Masvidal, that he's shifted his focus from Conor McGregor to fighting the guys that have been around, that have been punching and kicking each other for 15 years. And who doesn't want to see that fight? So the sport's moving on from Conor. Nate Diaz is moving on from Conor for now, and I'm thankful for that. All right, so main event of the evening, UFC heavyweight title on the line, Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic. A fight that, I was excited for, fight that you were excited for, fight that the world was watching, a rematch to the super fight where Daniel Cormier obviously knocked out Stipe Miocic the first go around, and this time, and new two-time UFC heavyweight champ Stipe Miocic. I got to tell you, I'm very thankful that Stipe won this fight. And I have a lot of issues with how this fight played itself out. And my take might be controversial or whatever, but it's just my honest opinion. I watch the fights, I react, and see the fights how I see them, and then I tell you guys how I see them. And you guys take it or leave it on the Thomas take. So Daniel Cormier fought. I want to really be careful about how I say this, but Daniel Cormier fought kind of dirty throughout that fight. Not kind of dirty, very dirty throughout that fight. And there was a theme in the first fight that took place that was really glossed over. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to bring it up as a reason as to why Daniel Cormier won that first fight versus Stipe Miocic. But the simple fact is that if you watch DC versus Stipe 1, you would see that DC and Stipe felt each other out. They threw punches. They moved around a little bit. And DC poked Stipe in the eye. Upon the replay, it showed DC throw his hand out there and flick Stipe Miocic with his fingers right in the eye, which was extremely dirty. Can't even debate that. And the tough part about this sport is that the fighters have open-fingered gloves. So for grappling, you have to have those. They could implement a new glove where the glove wraps around the fingers. Fingers are still open, but the glove itself would wrap around the fingers, but they haven't done that. And I don't know why, but it would look very similar to a boxing glove, but it would be, a little bit MMA-esque. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but they haven't yet. Open finger gloves, and Cormier likes to put his hands out there to set things up. But he did it so much more in the heavyweight fights with Stipe due to the fact that he has a reach disadvantage, a height disadvantage, a size disadvantage. So Cormier would get in close, put his hands out, force Stipe to kind of look through his hands and seek the target through his hands, and then Cormier would throw a punch. And then Stipe would be discombobulated because DC's hands would be out there, whether they were in his face or whether his fingers were in his eyes or not. It was a tactic by DC to do that. But in the first fight, he blatantly poked Stipe in the eye. Stipe took the second to reset, and I don't think he took enough time. And DC proceeded to land another clinch, on him and get a solid punch in and knock Stipe out. That was the end of the first fight. So it became apparent to me early on that was what was going to happen again, that DC was going to stick his fingers in Miocic's face. And the first round, DC got a takedown and used his wrestling. So I thought, okay, this might be, DC using his wrestling to win the fight. But then the second round starts, and DC starts to have success with this tactic of sticking his hands out, putting him in Miocic's face, and then throwing a punch. And DC poked Stipe in the eye again. And referee Herb Dean, one of the veteran referees of mixed martial arts, I don't know the exact statistic on this, but I believe that there are only two guys that have reffed, or there was only one guy that has reffed as many MMA fights as Herb Dean, and that is probably Big John. But Big John, as we know, has been a commentator for Bellator, and Herb Dean has been reffing ever since then, that time frame. So 3 years, Dean has got on Big John McCarthy. So by now, it'd be safe to say that Herb Dean has reffed more fights than Big John. And if that's the case, you see a fighter get poked in the eye, you see the fighter then touch his eye, why was there not a pause in the action? There was a moment there where DC poked Stipe in the eye again, and then DC knew it and just threw punches. That was scummy. That was a dirtbag move by DC. I'll say it. If nobody else is going to say it, I will say it. That was dirty. That was dirty. And it almost won him the fight in the second round. I was so thankful that the heavens, whoever it was out there, was making sure that Stipe had that granite chin that he has had, throughout the years. Stipe took a lot of punches. It almost looked like at points in the fight that Stipe was trying to get knocked out. His hands low, not moving, staying in one spot, not moving side to side, not being an elusive target out there, and just being a little bit flat-footed, to say the least. Getting stuck in these exchanges with DC way too long. And, those rounds play themselves out. I couldn't tell you if Miocic was winning a round prior to what took place in the fourth round. And I'm sitting there, and I'm not saying that I have any coaching credentials of mixed martial arts. I watch the sport as a diehard MMA fan, but I think you can learn a lot from watching fights. You can learn a lot. That's what coaches do. That's what fighters do. They watch the fights and they learn. And I've learned a lot watching these fights over the years. And I know one thing about Daniel Cormier. The biggest area on Daniel Cormier's body is his torso. He's very wide. And I'm pleading for Stipe to throw some body punches, throw some kicks, throw a leg kick, throw something other than a 1-2 to DC's head that is clearly not working. DC's just getting out of the way in time. DC's maybe too far in close with the punches just glancing off of DC's shoulders. That was not working good enough. Round after round after round from the second round on, I'm pleading for Miocic to throw body shots. He finally did it in the fourth round. You can ask anybody that I was with, body shots, please throw those body shots. He finally does. He lands these left hooks to the body probably 13 out of 16 times that he threw that punch within that round. He kept going to that punch. He throws it again, gets DC to drop his hands, throws a big overhand right. It lands on DC, follows it up with a left, follows it up with a couple other punches, and boom, the fight's over. And new UFC heavyweight champ, Stipe Miocic, two-time heavyweight champ. And I got to say, I'm very thankful for that, because I did not wait a year for that fight to see DC poke Miocic in the eye again continuously, or put his fingers in Miocic's face again. I didn't wait a year to see that. I was very pissed off at the tactics that were used by Daniel Cormier in that fight last night. It was frustrating. I thought DC would win. I didn't really have a rooting interest. I just wanted to see a good fight. And I knew that it wouldn't have been a good fight if that would have just continued and DC would have won a decision. I'll tell you this. The bar was full, and when Miocic knocked out DC, it roared. The bar roared. So the rooting interest was definitely for Miocic, but I think that prior to the fight, the rooting interest was, well, we just want to see a good fight. But when people saw the way that Daniel Cormier was fighting, putting his fingers in the face of Miocic like that constantly, that gets old after a while. And when the ref, known as Herb Dean, the veteran ref of this sport, doesn't do anything about that, that's a problem. That's a real problem, and that fight definitely needs to be reevaluated as far as Herb Dean's reffing performance. I thought that Herb Dean could have reffed that fight a lot better. My allergies are through the roof right now. But I thought Herb Dean could have reffed that fight a whole lot better than he did. The action needed to be paused, and he needed to tell DC not to do that. And the biased commentary of Joe Rogan, John Anik, and Dominic Cruz, we know that they're friends with DC. We know that. Doesn't have to be told to us during a fight. Doesn't have to be hinted at during a fight. I thought they were very biased in this fight in particular. And they're normally not. So that's just my observation. People can agree with it, disagree with it. That's how I saw it. Thought DC was poking Miocic in the eye or putting his fingers in his eyes repeatedly. And it was just dirty. And I was thankful that Miocic was able to finish that fight, get the belt back, and be the new UFC heavyweight champ. The question is, what's next for Daniel Cormier? To be honest, I really don't care what's next for Daniel Cormier. I'm kind of over it. I'm kind of over the DC thing. I'm over DC versus John Jones. Maybe they do a trilogy fight with Miocic and DC, but can we get a ref in there that is not going to let DC poke Miocic in the eye? Can we get that for the third fight? Is that a possibility? Can I throw in that request? Man, that was bad, guys. That was bad. That was not what I want to see as a proponent of MMA, as a guy that talks about MMA on his podcast. That's not what I want to see. And I hope that I'm not the only one that talks about this, because if I am, I think that makes me look really smart, and I think that makes a lot of personalities and analysts look kind of stupid for not talking about this, because this is a problem. Other fighters do it, but DC did it at a epically high level in that fight last night. Oh, you got to do whatever you got to do. There's no rule against it. No, you're the ref. Your job is to protect both fighters. Make sure that none of that stuff goes down. And I thought Herb Dean did a terrible job last night. I thought it was one of his worst reffing performances in his reffing career. And he's had an illustrious reffing career. He's reffed a lot of big fights. He's reffed a lot of fights, period, whether it be in the UFC or other organizations. And I thought he did really bad last night. He was my LVP, least valuable player of the night. Daniel Cormier, I don't know what's next for him. Outside of the Miocic trilogy fight, I think that's it. I think that fight last night between DC and Miocic killed any possibility of a Jones versus DC3. I had little to no interest in that fight prior to DC fighting Miocic, and I don't think that fight's going to happen now. But I really hope you enjoyed my UFC 241 post-fight reaction show. I'm Ryan Thomas. You can tune into my podcast, the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as Trainwreck Sports. Join the takeover. Follow me on Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take and Instagram, Ryan Thomas Take. Like the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook page. Would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Big fight in September. Zabib Magomedov, September 7th, will take on Dustin Poirier. This will be a title unification bout with Poirier as the interim UFC lightweight champ and Habib, the reigning, defending, undisputed UFC lightweight champ, coming off the biggest win of his career over Conor McGregor about a year ago in October of 2018. UFC, 229? Yeah. So that'll be a good one. That'll be a big one. We'll preview that, as well as plenty of football talk on the show. Got my first fantasy football draft today for my work league. I am the reigning, defending, undisputed champion of this league. Won it in 2018, won it in 2017, and your boy's going to try like hell to win it in 2019. I'm Ryan Thomas. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Have a great Sunday. Enjoy the weather. Beautiful day out in Western New York. Hopefully it's a beautiful day wherever you are. Take care.